On the morning of June 1st, 2026, the South Korean stock market triggered a circuit breaker because it rose too fast. This was not the first time. For over a year, the Korean stock market has been ignited by the AI memory boom, with the index repeatedly breaking all-time highs. Samsung became a market favorite again. SK Hynix was even more extreme, that a company that just a few years ago was cursed by Korean retail investors as a national trash stock has transformed into one of the craziest winners in the global AI supply chain. With its market cap surging past $1 trillion in the past few years, the whole world has been talking about NVIDIA's computing chips. But the market suddenly realized that in AI servers, the items that are truly sold out and impossible to grab aren't just the GPUs, it's also those few tiny memory chips right next to them. It is precisely these memory chips that have rewritten the destiny of SK Hynix and pushed the entire Korean stock market to an unprecedented height. In today's episode, we're going to talk about this tiny memory chip. Why did it suddenly turn from a supporting role inside a computer into the most sought-after strategic resource in the AI era? How was it first invented in the United States and then snatched away by Japanese companies? How did the Koreans start from scratch and climb to the top in 10 years, even turning around to sell the technology back to their former teacher? And how was Japan, which once controlled 80% of the global market, slowly worn down and wiped out? Finally, in what posture has China finally squeezed its way into this market? This is a 50-year memory war. Hello everyone. I am a new content creator. Glasses.my day job involves researching various companies in my spare time. I get particularly obsessed with all sorts of weird and intriguing things. Going forward, I will be continuously sharing in-depth content here that I personally find valuable, mostly focusing on business, but occasionally touching on some interesting trivia. Speaking of which, this episode was originally planned to be my very first one, but I hadn't finished organizing the materials. Coincidentally, on May 28th, Anthropic's valuation surpassed OpenAI for the first time. I had previously done deep research on this, and the materials were ready, so I temporarily pushed that out as the first episode. If you haven't seen it yet, feel free to check my homepage for that video. Memory. This track has a history spanning over 50 years. The content is truly too vast, so I've split it into two parts. The other part is already mostly completed. I will pull an all-nighter to finish it tonight and publish it tomorrow. Back to the story of memory. These 50 years in the 1970s, there were over 20 companies around the world making this chip. After 50 years of fighting, only 3.5 players remain at the table: Samsung, SK Hynix, Micron, and China's CXMT, which has just genuinely taken a seat. This is not a simple story where advancing technology leads to increasing corporate success. Quite the opposite. Almost everyone who sits at the center of the table is eventually pushed off by the very people they taught. The Americans invented it, turned around, and were beaten to the ground by Japan. The Japanese master craftsmen, with blueprints tucked in their pockets, secretly flew to Korea every weekend to teach, personally training their own gravediggers in order to cripple Japan. The United States incidentally helped Korea onto the horsepoint four nations. 50 years, a protagonist switch every 10 years. And the script is almost identical. Once today's challenger reaches the top, they will quickly become the next target of the hunt. The true starting point of this story is neither in Korea nor in Japan, but we have to go back to IBM in the 1960s. At that time, computers were getting stronger and stronger, but there was one persistent, nagging problem. Getting a machine to remember things was too expensive. Early memory commonly used magnetic core storage. You can imagine it as a bunch of tiny iron rings. Each tiny ring represented a memory cell. They had to be threaded one by one, under a microscope, by workers. It was reliable. Indeed, but expensive and slow, making mass deployment difficult. So, the memory of early computers was essentially a semi-handcrafted industrial product. Another path was to use transistors for memory cells. But the problem here was also obvious. Storing a single bit required 6 transistors. If a machine wanted to remember a bit more, costs and surface area would immediately balloon. It was at this moment that IBM researcher Robert Dennard stepped onto the stage. One night, in 1966, Dennard was sitting on his sofa in the living room when an idea suddenly struck him. Could we use just one transistor plus one capacitor to store a single bit of information? IBM's previous transistor memory solution was to build a small circuit that would hold one of 2 stable states, one representing 0 and the other representing 1. Its advantage was stability and high speed. The disadvantage was glaring. One bit consumed 6 transistors. In Dennard's proposal, the actual information was stored in a tiny capacitor, eliminating the need for a whole group of transistors. Charge in the capacitor represented one state. No charge represented the other. The adjacent transistor merely acted as a switch to control when to write to it and when to read from it. With this, a memory cell was compressed into a minimalist structure. One transistor, one capacitor, storing one bit. This changed the structure of memory. Once each memory cell could be made simple enough, the memory chips had the opportunity to continuously shrink, mass-produce, and drop in price. DRAM, dynamic random access memory, was born. It was fast, but it was also forgetful, because a capacitor is like a small cup that slowly leaks water. The charge inside will dissipate, so it must constantly be refreshed to maintain its memory. It is precisely for this reason that it is called dynamic memory. From this moment on, the true rules of the game for the memory industry were written. Whoever could make the same memory smaller, cheaper, and more stable would have the chance to sit at the center of the table. The first company to turn DRAM into a business was Intel. Today, everyone thinks Intel is a CPU company, but actually, when it was founded in 1968, it was in the memory business. The goal was to replace those bulky magnetic cores with chips. In 1970, Intel launched the world's first commercial DRAM, codenamed 1103. Its sales manager later famously said, "Customers hated it, but they were all using it." As for CPUs, at that time inside Intel, it was just an unremarkable side hustle. By 1974, Intel's DRAM held nearly 83% of the global market share, but soon, a company called MOSTEK, relying on a technique called address multiplexing, knocked Intel off its throne. Once capturing 75% of the global share, the MOSTEK itself was later acquired by an industrial conglomerate, fell into mismanagement, and slowly crumbled. In 1978, for engineers who left MOSTEK ran to a small town called Boise in Idaho. In the basement of a dental clinic, they scraped together a few $100,000 and founded a company. Micron was very poor in its early days. The ink for the logo on the first batch of chips wasn't dry, and it smeared customers' motherboards. IBM and Apple both rejected them. Micron's CFO had to use a hair dryer every day to dry the chips one by one just to keep the orders. Later, A potato tycoon invested $1 million in them. It is said that the old man misheard chips as chips, like potato chips, which is why he happily paid up. In English, they are the same word. But no one could have guessed that this company would become the most crucial and surprising character in the whole drama that followed, just as the Americans were. Chasing each other, Japan, across the Pacific Ocean, was quietly working on a major undertaking in a completely different way. In 1976, Japan forcibly dragged 5 sworn enemy companies, Hitachi, Mitsubishi, Fujitsu, Toshiba, and NEC, to one table and launched a joint research project called the VLSI project. The government put up a portion of the money. The companies put up a portion, and these 5 rivals fought shoulder to shoulder on the most cutting-edge technology, only to then slaughter each other in the marketplace. After 4 years, Japan's DRAM yield rate reached 70 to 80%, while the United States during the same period was still stuck at 50 to 60%. What does this concept mean? From the same silicon wafer, the Japanese could cut out more good, sellable chips. The factory, equipment, materials, and electricity costs were roughly the same, but once the yield rate is high, the cost drops directly. In the memory business, yield rate is almost the jugular, because the most profitable window for a new generation of memory is often just the first few months after it hits the market. Whoever can ramp up the yield rate fastest can rake in the cash during that high price window. But what truly stunned the Americans wasn't just the cost. It was the quality. In 1980, an engineer at Hewlett-Packard ran a test, comparing Japanese and American memory side by side. The results were humiliating for Silicon Valley. The failure rate of Japan's worst batch was several times lower than that of America's best batch. On average, the defect rate of American chips was nearly 5 times that of Japan's. This test dropped like a bomb on Silicon Valley. The first reaction of the Americans was to curse. "You are dumping, stealing the market with low prices." But HP's data was right there. Japan wasn't just cheaper. They were genuinely capable of making better and cheaper products. The Japanese even went a bit overboard. Their memory could last 25 years. But in that era, a computer might be replaced in 5 years. 25 years. That lifespan actually exceeded the real demand. By 1989, Japan commanded 53% of global semiconductor revenue, while the US was left with just 37%. For every 2 chips produced in the world, 1 came from Japan. Intel couldn't hold on anymore. It pulled out of the DRAM market and pivoted to making CPUs. It shut down 7 of its 8 memory factories, laying off a third of its workforce. On the day the factories disbanded, employees hugged each other and wept in the parking lot. This is how America handed the market it had created over to Japan on a silver platter. But America would not take this lying down. It wanted to fight this war, and the battleground was Capitol Hill. In 1985, it was that same poor and aggressive Micron that first jumped out to file a dumping complaint with the U.S. Department of Commerce against 6 major Japanese companies. At the time, it wasn't even a member of the Semiconductor Industry Association. The investigation yielded shocking results. The selling price of Japanese memory was only about half of its production cost. This was no longer normal competition. This was clearly an attempt to suffocate the opponent to death. Right after this, another incident fully ignited the powder keg between the US and Japan. A subsidiary of Toshiba secretly sold high-precision machine tools, capable of machining nuclear submarine propellers, to the Soviet Union. Once these propellers were built, NATO's underwater anti-submarine sonar might become useless. After the matter was exposed, America exploded. In 1987, several U.S. congressmen marched to the steps of the Capitol. Building, swung sledgehammers, and smashed a Toshiba radio to pieces in front of a live national broadcast. That same year, President Reagan imposed a punitive tariff of 100% on Japanese electronics. This was the first time since World War II that America had retaliated against its own ally in this way. Coupled with that famous Plaza Accord, the Japanese yen nearly doubled in value against the US dollar within 2 years. Costs doubled, and prices were pinned down. Japan was viciously squeezed. But here lies the joke that history loves to play. The United States went to all this trouble to hit Japan. But the one that truly benefited in the end was the bystander who had been quietly waiting for an opportunity. Korea.it was neither America itself, nor Micron, who had led the charge, because just 2 years before Micron took the lead in suing Japan for dumping, in 1983, it did something that seemed inconsequential at the time, but later changed the fate of the entire industry. It licensed its 64K memory design to a Korean company for a price of $3 million, and even sent 8 engineers over to teach them hand in hand. That Korean company was called Samsung. That on a late night in February 1983, the 74-year-old Lee Byung-chul made a phone call. The founder of Samsung said one thing on that call: Samsung is going to do semiconductors. He was prepared to invest at least $100 million at the time. This looked like an insane decision, but in Lee Byung-chul's eyes, it was anything but crazy. This was the exact same move he had made his whole life. Watching closely how the Japanese made money, importing the complete set of equipment and technology, studying it desperately, and then producing it at an even lower cost. From rice, sugar, to textiles and fertilizer, he climbed up step by step. Every step was planted firmly on a track the Japanese had already validated. Semiconductors weren't even his first encountered. As early as 1974, he overruled all objections to acquire a failing Korean semiconductor factory. At the time, the whole company thought chips were useless, high-tech toys. Only he was certain about one thing: in the future, every household appliance would need a chip inside. That is why he wanted Samsung to get a 10-year head start and master this craft. But courage alone wasn't enough. They also needed someone willing to teach. Samsung went to Hitachi, Motorola, NEC, Texas Instruments, and Toshiba, wanting to buy memory technology licenses. They were rejected by all of them. Neither the Japanese nor the Americans were stupid. No one was willing to teach a future competitor. Only that cash-strapped little company in Idaho, Micron, was willing to sell, but Micron's design alone wasn't enough. The design was a blueprint. How to turn the blueprint into a yield, a qualified finished product, was another, more difficult craft. In terms of process technology, Samsung found a helper no one expected: Japan's Sharp. Sharp had always been an outsider in Japanese semiconductor circles. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry's Big Five alliance didn't invite it to play. It was precisely this ostracized Sharp that became the only one willing to teach the manufacturing process to the Koreans. Coupled with Korean-American engineers poached from Silicon Valley with high salaries, and equipment bought from the US and Japan, Samsung quickly pieced together these fragments from all directions and built a wafer fabrication plant in Gyeonggi Province. Design from America, process from Japan, talent from Silicon Valley, equipment from the US and Japan. After assembling all this, with zero experience, Samsung took just 6 months to brute force its way into producing the 64K memory, but its cost was 4 to 5 times that of the Japanese. Initially, this thing couldn't even be sold in Korea itself. Even Korea's own computer factories didn't want to use it. For Samsung, whether making memory was profitable was secondary. What it wanted was an entry ticket into the high-tech world. The following years, Samsung bled profusely. From 1983 to 1988, cumulative losses exceeded 200 billion Korean won, nearly wiping out its equity. With its debt ratio approaching 300%, any normal company would have long since thrown in the towel. But Samsung was no ordinary company. It was a chaebol. It possessed 3 things others didn't. A blood bank that could siphon money from other profitable businesses to feed the semiconductor division. A kind of capital patience that could endure prolonged losses. And a chairman who could make a decisive phone call in the dead of night. This third point was precisely the fatal weakness of the Japanese. Decisions by those large Japanese companies to invest hundreds of billions of yen had to go through layers of company-wide, repeated rounds of discussion. By the time they were done discussing, the Korean's factory was already built. But Samsung's real killer move was a strategy called counter-cyclical investment. Normal companies, during a downturn when prices are falling, would pull back and cut production to save their lives. Samsung did the opposite. The worse the market, the more money it threw in. In 1986, memory prices plummeted from $4 to 30 cents. They were losing $1 on every chip sold. Samsung lost $300 million that year. Its equity was wiped out. Debt ratio nearing 300%. Not only did it not stop, it continued to expand production. In 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, the Korean won depreciated to a fraction of its former value. Lee Kuan-hee declared, "We must stake our lives and property and go all in," and built 4 factories in one go. In 2008, when memory prices collapsed, Samsung took 118% of its previous year's profit, meaning it invested more than the entire amount it had earned, and still expanded further. This approach looked crazy on the accounting books, but strategically, it was a ruthless masterstroke, because every penny invested at the bottom of the cycle would, in the next upswing, give it a cost edge that was a cut above its competitors. While its opponents were struggling to endure losses, it continued to increase its investment, because it could withstand the pain. Once the others fell one by one, the entire market was his, and Micron, the company that had sold its technology to Samsung, watched helplessly as this student overtook it. Micron's founder, Ward Parkinson, later said a very helpless line: "No matter what we do, Samsung imitates it, and they learn faster than we can do it." In 1992, Samsung ascended to the #1 spot in the memory world. From an upstart buying a license to world champion, it took less than 10 years. The master led them in the door, and the apprentice turned around and left the master in the dust. How did Samsung learn so fast? Apart from that $3 million Micron technology, there was a more secretive path. Starting in the 1980s, every Friday night, on the flights from Tokyo to Seoul, sat a group of low-profile Japanese engineers. During the day, they still worked at Japanese memory fabs. Come the weekend, they secretly flew to Korea to act as consultants for Samsung and Hyundai, unreservedly pouring out all the tricks of the production line. They would fly back late Sunday night. Samsung offered triple their Japanese salary, plus a house and a car. These people, dubbed moonlight engineers, piece by piece, moved the craftsmanship the Japanese had accumulated for decades across the sea. And the most humiliating part for the Japanese was yet to come. Once Samsung was firmly established, it did something that hadn't happened in half a century. It reverse licensed its new generation of memory technology to Japanese manufacturers. This was the first time in history that Korea exported semiconductor technology to Japan. The apprentice who had once knelt and begged for a license, refused by everyone, had now turned into the one selling technology to the master. The positions of master and apprentice had completely reversed. That Korea's rise to the top didn't just rely on Samsung alone. IT had a backup that had narrowly escaped death. The founder of the Hyundai Group, Chung Ju-young, asked the exact same question as Samsung. The Japanese can do semiconductors. Why can't we Koreans? He called this stuff the rice of industry. Hyundai Electronics was founded in 1983. But Hyundai was in an even worse position than Samsung. Samsung at least had the Micron license. Hyundai broke through in a technological vacuum, relying on Texas Instruments, some basic licenses from Taiwan, and reverse engineering, bit by bit gnawing through the problem. Engineers literally lived in the factory, launching a 150-day campaign to achieve a 50% yield rate. In its 5th year of existence, 1988, it turned a profit for the first time. Hyundai's ability to break through in a technological vacuum owes credit to one man, Min Wei-ji, an engineer poached from Intel. Back then, memory was stuck on increasing capacity, a fork in the road. To stuff more capacity into a chip, should you dig deep trenches in the silicon, called trenching, or stack layers on the surface, called stacking? The two paths were irreconcilable. Companies that bet wrong lost their shirts. Min Wei-ji didn't bet. He directly set up an arena, having two teams each take a path and compete against each other. Whoever had the higher yield rate would decide the outcome. In 1991, the result came in stacking. 1. Because it had fewer steps and a higher yield. He also established a rule, a short meeting every morning, where the most junior engineers could also directly point out mistakes and make decisions. IT was about the issue, not the person. In the cracks between Samsung and the Japanese giants, Hyundai hard-carved a path to survival. What made it truly formidable was a strategy called 3-generation parallel development. While the 4M memory was still ramping up mass production, he already had another team attacking the 16M, and yet another team doing advanced research on the even more distant 64M. 3 generations were developed simultaneously, compressing the interval between each generation to just 1.5 years. This was the key that allowed Hyundai to later keep up and stick close to Samsung. And Samsung and Hyundai weren't the only Korean companies betting on memory. The third was called Gold Star, which was the predecessor of LG Electronics. IT started the latest, so it simply took a more direct path. IT went to Japan's Hitachi and packed up the product design, manufacturing process, equipment list, and technical personnel, the whole package, and moved it back to Korea. In the words of its executive, we were essentially replicating one of Hitachi's wafer fabs. With this one move, Goldstar caught up to the 1M memory in less than 2 years. Samsung bought Micron's design. Hyundai relied on reverse engineering and learned secretly by doing foundry work for Texas Instruments. Goldstar directly copied Hitachi. Not one of these 3 Korean companies invented anything out of thin air. They all piece by piece moved over the technologies built up by the US and Japan and gradually transformed them into their own. How do latecomers catch up with pioneers? This is the most simple and most effective answer. But Hyundai and Goldstar were both fated for bitter hardship. Since the 1997 Asian financial crisis, memory prices were chopped in half, and then in half again, within a few months. The worst hit model fell from $30 all the way down to 80 cents. Hyundai Electronics almost didn't survive the first brush with death. And it was during those same years that the Korean government stepped in to prevent the chaebols from burning money over each other in the same industry. It forcibly implemented an industrial restructuring called the Big Deal, harshly merging peers together in the semiconductor sector. The named companies were the previously mentioned Hyundai and the one called Goldstar, which had by now changed its name to LG. In 1999, Hyundai Electronics swallowed LG's semiconductor business, along with a colossal debt of nearly $14 billion. From this moment on, the third Korean memory player vanished from the table. That bloodline of technology that LG had painstakingly gnawed out by replicating Hitachi's fab, and the bloodline of Hyundai, cultivated through independent struggle and by secretly learning from Texas Instruments, were forcibly twisted into a single rope, but the merger did not bring a respite. Instead, it crashed head-on into an even greater storm in 2000. The dot-com bubble burst, and the semiconductor industry entered winter point. 2001 became its darkest year, but IT lost $2.5 billion. Its debt exceeded 15 trillion Korean won. Its debt-to-asset ratio was as high as 206%. Its stock price fell from over 26,000 Korean won all the way down to a low of 1,115 won. Reduced to mere spare change, IT became what Korean retail investors called a national trash stock. It was in that same year, with no way out, that it simply discarded even the Hyundai nameplate and gave itself a new name that nobody had heard of at the time. Hynix. That's where the name comes from for the SK Hynix of today. The company that Nvidia can't live without, whose market cap has surged past $1 trillion. Two unlucky souls forced into a corner by the times, bound together by the state, changed their appearance, and barely managed to cling to life. The company was promptly taken over by creditor banks, had a financial straitjacket put on it, and was strictly managed for a full 10 years at the end of 2001. That familiar face appeared again. Micron proposed to acquire Hynix, but with a condition: it would only take the assets, not the roughly $6 billion in debt. By all logic, for a nearly bankrupt company with a stock price that had fallen to just over $1, being acquired should have been a godsend. But Hynix's board of directors, management, and labor unions stood united on one line, with rare solidarity. They all rejected it. They said, "Semiconductors are Korea's lifeline. We would rather go bankrupt than ever hand it over." The tenacious Hynix ultimately relied on debt restructuring and on eking out new products from discarded, obsolete equipment to hang on to life by a thread and survived. IT struggled through until Valentine's Day, 2012. When a man named Chae Tae-won made his move. The SK Group, which he helmed, South Korea's third-largest chaebol, acquired Hynix for 3.37 trillion Korean won. This was the largest corporate acquisition in Korean history at the time. That is the origin of the name SK Hynix. But as soon as the news came out, SK's own stock price immediately dropped 15%. Spending $3 billion to buy a memory company that had twice been on the brink of bankruptcy and just crawled out of the ICU. Everyone thought it was a mistake. Chae Tae-won had only one reply: I am not betting on Hynix, that I am betting that information will become the next oil. It would take another 12 years for the world to understand the weight of this statement, on the day AI finally exploded. But that is a story for the next episode. While the two Korean companies were escaping death and steadily rising, the former hegemon, Japan, was heading towards its final destination. That Japan's loss was somewhat unjust, because its technology actually hadn't been bad. The yen's appreciation caused by the Plaza Accord, the bursting of the domestic bubble, and the relentless pressure from the Korean competitors, and most lethally, the very formula that once brought it success, had all turned into shackles. Lifetime employment, corporate groupism, the vertical integration where it did everything itself, and that painfully slow decision-making system. Samsung's average investment in memory from 1993 to 2000 was 4.7 times that of the four major Japanese companies. Japan's way of decision-making, with meetings that seemed to stretch on until the end of time, simply couldn't hold the line. Japan's share slid from 81% globally in 1987 down to 49% in 1990, was surpassed by Samsung in 1993, and by 1999 was left with just 25%. Japanese companies began to withdraw one by one. Finally, the remaining strength was consolidated into a company called Elpida. The name was taken from the Greek word for hope. But hope couldn't hold on either. Elpida's costs were absurdly high. It used specialized equipment for every single process. The output from one wafer was only half of Samsung's. Its profit margin was 3%, while Samsung's was 30%, a tenfold difference. In 2011, memory prices collapsed again. Elpida lost nearly $1.2 billion in a little over half a year. At the end of February 2012, Elpida formally filed for bankruptcy, with liabilities of around $5.5 billion. This was one of the largest bankruptcies in Japanese manufacturing history, from ruling 80% of the globe in 1987 to zero in 2012. Japan's memory empire had thus fallen, and on the very evening that Elpida went bankrupt, a few hundred kilometers away, Samsung's headquarters near Seoul was ablaze with lights through the night. Elpida's last president was a man named Yukio Sakamoto. He was a very unique individual, a gymnastics major from a sports college. He was called the most un-Japanese Japanese person. After his company was gone, he was not reconciled. In 2019, at the age of 72, he went and joined China's Tsinghua Uni Group, wanting to leverage China's power to take revenge on the adversaries who had annihilated Japan's industry. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2024 at the age of 77. The revenge was ultimately never completed. The company that acquired Elpida was, once again, Micron. It spent roughly $2 billion, taking in Elpida along with its 16,000 engineers. But this deal later proved to be buying the past and missing the future. Micron took over Elpida's vast production capacity, but failed to take over its most crucial next-generation technology. A new type of memory called HBM was quietly changing the battlefield, and neither Elpida nor Micron was at that table. As for Micron, that company with the most complex role, it made practically every mistake in the book. It personally fed and raised Samsung. It led the charge against Japan, paving the road for Korea. It bought Elpida and missed out on HBM. It also twice dragged its peers to court, turning state's witness as a whistleblower in exchange for immunity, completely draining whatever trust remained in the industry. But it just couldn't be killed. Reflecting on these 50 years, there is a rather cold rule about the companies that were eliminated. The ones that lasted to the end were often not the ones with the strongest technology, but those with the least debt on their books. When Elpida fell, its debt was already so high it crushed itself. Micron, on the other hand, had almost always had the lowest leverage in the industry. The cleanest balance sheet to IT was precisely this conservative nature, poor to the point of having nothing but cash, that allowed it to outlast its rivals by that one extra breath in every single deadly winter. Of course, there was an even more pragmatic reason. If Micron went down, the entire memory industry would become a duopoly of two Korean companies that would trigger even more severe anti-monopoly scrutiny. Therefore, no matter how many mistakes it made, the industry needed it to stay alive in this racetrack that specializes in devouring companies. Micron proved one thing. Longevity itself is the strongest core competitive advantage. Let's go back to the beginning. In 2009, there were still 10 companies in the world making memory. Just a few years later, that number dropped to 3. Germany's Commando went bankrupt. Japan's Elpida was wiped out. The remaining small players withdrew from the cutting-edge competition. America invented it, Japan dominated and then fell, and Korea ascended to the top. Over 50 years, over 20 companies fought fiercely, leaving only 3 names at the end: Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. A seemingly stable three-kingdom pattern had finally formed. But even this three-kingdom pattern was unstable. Samsung, which had sat on the throne for 33 years, saw its market share drop from 41% to 17% in a single year. Hynix, that company that had twice hovered near bankruptcy and was called the living dead, now had a market cap surging past $1 trillion, ranking among the world's most valuable companies, stepping on its former master. What turned the three-kingdom pattern upside down was a new kind of memory, HBM, and the earliest one to bet on it was, of all players, that poorest, most desperate Hynix. Che Tae-won's statement that information would become the next oil was about to come true. And it was at this moment that China officially took a seat at the table. In the next episode, we will tell this story of the throne's change in the AI era. How did Hynix, after 16 years of being benched, counterkill its old masters? How did China barge in from the rubble, relying on the legacy of a bankrupt German company? And why is it that in this industry, which has burned through hundreds of billions of dollars and dragged countless giants into their graves, only these few can ultimately survive? That's all for this episode. Creating in-depth videos is not easy. If you found the content inspiring, please help by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep going.